It was supposed to be a routine search, a quick inspection of an old estate that had been quietly owned by Keanu Reeves for years. But when the police arrived at his massive villa tucked away in the hills, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. The sprawling property, shrouded in mystery and seclusion, was exactly what you'd expect from a Hollywood superstar who preferred privacy over fame. But even the most seasoned officers were not prepared for what they found. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, the police team made their way down to the basement of the grand villa. It had been an anonymous tip, nothing too specific, just that there was something off about the place. The team's leader, Detective Michelle Harris, wasn't convinced at first. Keanu Reeves had always been a model citizen, the kind of celebrity who avoided scandals and stayed far from any controversies. Yet, as they began to dig around the property, things began to feel wrong. "Detective, you need to see this," one of the officers called out from the back of the basement. Michelle walked briskly towards the sound of his voice, her boots echoing off the cold concrete floors. What she found would change everything. The officer was crouched down beside a strange, old wooden door at the back of the basement. The door was nearly invisible, hidden behind a wall of cobwebs and dust. But there was something about it, something that didn't quite fit. "Is that a door?" Michelle asked, her voice thick with curiosity. The officer nodded. "It looks like it's been there for decades, maybe even longer. We didn't even know it was here." Michelle knelt down and carefully examined the door. It was oddly out of place. The wood, despite its age, seemed untouched by time. With a deep breath, she motioned for the team to assist. They pried open the door with effort, the heavy creaking sound echoing through the basement. What they found behind it was beyond anyone's expectations. A narrow, dark tunnel stretched before them, disappearing into the distance. The air felt different here, thicker, cooler, as if something ancient was hiding beneath the villa. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but Detective Harris stepped forward, determined to get to the bottom of it. "Get the lights now," she commanded, and the officers scrambled to do her bidding. The flickering beams of their flashlights revealed walls lined with strange carvings, symbols that seemed foreign, even haunting. The deeper they ventured into the tunnel, the more unsettled they became. The walls were lined with artifacts, objects that didn't belong in a modern house. As they moved further down the passage, the sense of unease grew. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, and the strange, almost oppressive atmosphere intensified. But what came next was the true shock. At the end of the tunnel, hidden in a small, cold chamber, they discovered something no one could have ever imagined. A collection of old, cryptic documents, pages yellowed with age, lay scattered on the ground. They were filled with names, dates, and cryptic codes that made little sense to the officers. But what caught their attention the most was the large, faded photo pinned to the wall. It was a picture of Keanu Reeves. But this wasn't a celebrity photo taken at some premiere. This was an old black and white photo, taken decades ago, showing Keanu standing beside a group of people, each with an unmistakable look of fear on their faces. Behind them was a large, stone structure, one that was strangely similar to the tunnel they had just uncovered. The officers froze, their faces drained of color. Detective Harris felt a chill run down her spine. The discovery wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. "What in the world?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Something didn't add up. What was Keanu involved in all these years? What was this tunnel for? And why had it been hidden all this time? As the discovery set in, Detective Harris felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. The Hollywood icon that everyone thought they knew now seemed like a man with a past full of dark secrets. She turned to her team, eyes narrowing. "We're not telling anyone about this yet. Not until we figure out exactly what's going on here." The officers nodded, their faces still pale from the unsettling scene. Detective Harris took one last look at the tunnel's entrance before shutting the door, sealing the secret back into the shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that what they'd uncovered was only the beginning of something far more sinister. And as she left the villa, she couldn't help but wonder, was Keanu Reeves the innocent celebrity he appeared to be, or was he hiding a dark truth beneath his fame? Keanu Reeves was a name synonymous with calm, collected strength. On the surface, he was the beloved star of Hollywood action films, known for his roles in The Matrix and John Wick. Fans adored him not only for his acting but for his quiet, humble personality, one that seemed to resist the glitz and glamour of the entertainment industry. He rarely made headlines for anything other than his work, and even then, he kept things low-key. To most, Keanu was an enigma, a man of few words, whose life seemed perfectly aligned with the role of a stoic hero. But beneath that carefully curated image, Keanu harbored secrets that few could have imagined. Born in Beirut, Lebanon, to an English mother and an American father, Keanu's early life was one marked by constant change. His parents separated when he was just 3 years old, and Keanu's mother moved him across the world to Toronto, Canada, where he was raised. He never knew his father, who had left the family before Keanu could form any memories of him. The absence of a father figure left Keanu with a lingering sense of loneliness, a void he would carry for much of his life. Though his mother worked hard to provide for him, the family struggled financially. Keanu attended several schools in Toronto, but his early years were marked by academic struggles and a sense of being an outsider. He found solace in the arts, especially acting and music, where he could express the parts of himself he struggled to understand. His love for theater eventually led him to pursue acting, and by his late teens, Keanu had begun his career in television and film. But while his career took off, Keanu's personal life remained largely secluded. He kept a tight circle of friends, preferring quiet nights with those he trusted. In an industry full of fame-seeking stars, Keanu stood out by choosing to remain grounded, even avoiding the typical Hollywood party scene. He didn't care for the perks of celebrity, never buying flashy cars or expensive homes. Instead, he chose a simple lifestyle, often donating large portions of his earnings to charity without fanfare. It wasn't until years later that the world would learn about the true weight of Keanu's past, the hidden stories that shaped the man behind the on-screen hero. When Keanu was just 23, tragedy struck his life in a way that would forever change him. His closest sister, Kim, was diagnosed with leukemia. Keanu spent the next several years by her side, tirelessly helping with her treatment. He quietly took time off from filming to be with her, not seeking attention or sympathy, but doing what felt right for him. Tragically, after a lengthy battle, Kim passed away, leaving Keanu devastated. The grief of losing his sister was something he never fully recovered from, and it became clear that his personal losses and tragedies would become the driving forces behind his quiet persona. But it wasn't just his sister's death that marked a turning point for Keanu. A few years later, in 1999, he endured another devastating loss. Keanu's girlfriend, Jennifer Syme, was tragically killed in a car accident. Jennifer had been pregnant with their child at the time, and the loss of both her and their unborn daughter sent Keanu into a deep spiral of grief. He withdrew further from the public eye, choosing isolation over the public life that had once seemed so appealing. In interviews, Keanu spoke little about these personal tragedies, and when he did, his words were measured, as if he was keeping a part of himself locked away. Keanu's avoidance of the public's gaze only deepened the mystery surrounding him. People started to speculate about his strange, almost distant behavior. Some believed he was a tortured soul, scarred by his losses. Others thought he might be hiding something even darker. Despite the rumors, Keanu kept to himself, keeping his personal life tightly sealed from the public. But little did anyone know, the grief and pain he experienced were only the beginning of a much deeper story, one that had its roots in the very villa that the police had just uncovered. The villa in question was purchased by Keanu in the early 2000s, a time when he was beginning to feel the weight of his personal losses. Seeking solitude, he sought out a secluded location where he could live without the prying eyes of the media. The villa's location in the hills offered the perfect retreat, far away from the bustling city and the constant reminders of his tragedies. Keanu had been drawn to the property not just for its privacy, but for its strange allure. There was something about the place that felt familiar, as if it had been calling to him. It was around this time that Keanu began to uncover the villa's hidden history, and what he found would forever change his understanding of his own past. The discovery of the secret tunnel beneath the villa was not a complete surprise to Keanu. It was something he had known about for years, but had never fully explored. The tunnel had been a part of the property's original design, dating back to the early 1900s, long before Keanu had even set foot on the estate. The previous owner, a man by the name of Arthur Graves, was known for his eccentricity and secrecy. He had lived alone in the villa for decades, rarely seen by anyone except for his few close associates. Graves was a man of many secrets, a fact that intrigued Keanu when he first learned about the property's previous owner. Records were scarce, but rumors circulated that Graves had been involved in underground activities, perhaps linked to mysterious organizations. But as Keanu settled into the villa, he pushed these thoughts aside, focusing instead on his own healing process. It wasn't until one quiet afternoon, after years of living there, that Keanu discovered the hidden door in the basement. The door was concealed behind stacks of old furniture and dusty shelves, a relic from a time long past. Intrigued, Keanu pried open the door, revealing the tunnel that led beneath the villa. He hadn't told anyone about the tunnel. He had kept it to himself, exploring it in private. What he didn't know, however, was that the secrets buried there were not just about the villa's past, but about his own family, his bloodline, and a connection to a dark and dangerous world. As Keanu's past began to merge with the present, the secrets of the tunnel would soon reveal themselves, not just to him, but to the police and the world. And when they did, the truth would be more unsettling than anyone could have ever imagined. Detective Michelle Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery of the tunnel beneath Keanu Reeves' villa was just the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The unsettling silence that followed the police's first foray into the hidden passageway was almost unbearable. The officers had returned to the surface, their faces pale and taut with anxiety, while Michelle stood in the basement, her flashlight illuminating the symbols etched into the walls of the tunnel. What were they? And why was Keanu involved in something so strange? As the evening wore on, Michelle found herself poring over the initial findings. The cryptic photographs and documents scattered on the cold stone floor beneath the tunnel were more than just mysterious. They were disturbing. The ancient-looking photos showed Keanu standing next to a group of grim-faced individuals. In each photo, Keanu appeared much younger, but his eyes, they seemed to carry an intensity, a depth, as if he had already been burdened with a secret he couldn't share. The deeper Michelle dug, the more she uncovered about the history of the villa and its previous owner, Arthur Graves. Graves had been a private individual, but one with a shadowy reputation. The rumors surrounding him were far more sinister than anyone had initially guessed. Some claimed that Graves had been involved in occult practices, while others believed he had connections to secret societies with interests that went beyond mere wealth or power. The more Michelle read, the more she realized that this wasn't just a random historical curiosity. It was something much more personal. Michelle's team worked late into the night, analyzing the documents they'd found, trying to make sense of what seemed like a tangled mess of old records, family trees, and strange symbols. But even with all the evidence laid out in front of them, the pieces didn't fit together. There were gaps that seemed to point directly back to Keanu. It was then that Michelle made the decision to confront him. Keanu Reeves, for the first time in years, was being pulled into the public eye. The police had made no official statements, but the rumors were already spreading like wildfire. The media was buzzing with speculation about the hidden tunnel beneath his villa, about the strange artifacts discovered there, and about his past. One that, until now, had seemed so guarded and impenetrable. It was only a matter of time before the questions came for him, and when they did, Keanu was ready. Michelle stood at the door of Keanu's villa the following morning. She had spent hours reviewing every detail, every piece of information she had gathered, but the one thing she couldn't wrap her mind around was Keanu himself. How had he been involved in all of this? What was his connection to the tunnel? And why had he kept it hidden for so long? Keanu greeted her at the door, his expression calm, almost resigned. He looked every bit the star he was, dressed casually in a simple black jacket and jeans. But there was something different about him today. Something in his eyes. It was as if he knew this moment was inevitable. "Detective Harris," Keanu said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm assuming you've come for answers." Michelle nodded. "I need to know what's going on, Keanu." The tunnel, the documents, everything. It's all pointing back to you. And I don't think you're as innocent in this as you've led people to believe. Keanu's eyes briefly flickered with something akin to pain, but he quickly masked it. He stepped aside to let her in, and Michelle entered the villa, her mind racing. The atmosphere in the house was different now, heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Keanu led her to the sitting room, where he gestured for her to take a seat. "I don't know what you found, but I can guess," Keanu said quietly, his voice betraying little emotion. "I've been trying to bury the past for years. I didn't want anyone to know about it. And I certainly didn't want anyone poking around in that tunnel." Michelle sat down, her eyes never leaving him. "Why? What's in that tunnel that's so dangerous?" Keanu exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "That tunnel, it's part of something much older than me. Something that's been in my family for generations. You see, it's not just a tunnel, it's a doorway. And what lies beyond it is the key to everything. My family, my legacy, even the things I've lost." Michelle leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "What are you talking about? What's on the other side of that door?" Keanu stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this. There are people who have been watching me for a long time. People who have always known who I really am. And they've been waiting for me to return to that place, to finish what was started." Michelle felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. "What place? What are you talking about?" Keanu stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "There are things in that tunnel that I wish I'd never discovered. Things that, if known, could change everything. My entire life, everything I thought I understood about myself, it was all based on a lie." Michelle stood as well, taking a step closer to him. "What happened, Keanu? What's really going on?" Keanu's gaze flickered to the window, and for a moment, it was as if he wasn't even seeing her. His mind was far away, lost in the shadows of his past. "I never asked for this, but sometimes you don't get a choice. There are forces at play here, forces that I've spent my life trying to outrun. The truth is, I've been running from them. But now, it's catching up with me." The room was thick with tension. Michelle could sense that Keanu was barely holding it together. The walls he'd spent years building around himself were starting to crumble, and she was getting closer to the core of his darkest secrets. "I need to know everything, Keanu. The tunnel, the people, the connections, everything. If there's something dangerous going on, I can't protect you unless you tell me the truth." Keanu closed his eyes, as if gathering the strength to speak the words he had been avoiding for so long. Finally, he turned to face her. "There's a reason that tunnel was built under my villa. A reason why my family has always been tied to it. I'm not just some actor, Michelle. My bloodline runs deeper than you could ever imagine. And the truth? The truth is buried down there, waiting to be uncovered." Michelle's heart raced as she processed his words. She had heard whispers of families with hidden legacies, secret bloodlines, and dark histories, but nothing had prepared her for this. Keanu's past wasn't just about fame. It was about something far more dangerous, something that would soon pull her into a web of secrets that could unravel everything. The air in the villa was thick with tension, the weight of Keanu's cryptic words lingering in the space between him and Detective Harris. Michelle's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything Keanu had said, but the truth seemed just beyond her reach, as if it were buried under layers of secrecy that no one had dared to unearth. Keanu's bloodline, the tunnel, the strange symbols, the connections between them were becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michelle stood still, absorbing his words, while Keanu seemed lost in thought, his eyes clouded with something deep, regret, perhaps, or a fear that he couldn't fully shake. It was clear now that the secrets of the villa and the tunnel were not just about the past. They were a living, breathing part of Keanu's present. "So what exactly are you saying?" Michelle finally asked, her voice calm but firm. She needed to know, to understand, that your family has some sort of legacy? Something hidden beneath this villa? Keanu nodded, his face grim. "Yes, something that's been passed down for generations. but I don't know how deep it goes. I was never meant to be involved in it, detective. I thought I could escape it. I thought I could live a normal life, be just another actor in Hollywood, but I can't." His voice cracked slightly, and Michelle saw the burden he carried. More than just the grief of his past losses. It was the weight of a secret so vast, it threatened to swallow him whole. Michelle took a step forward, her expression softening. "Keanu, if there's something dangerous going on here, you have to let me help you. I'm not just investigating your past. I'm investigating a crime, a discovery in your home that could have serious consequences. Whatever it is you're running from, I need to know." Keanu looked at her, his eyes searching, as if weighing whether or not he could trust her with the truth. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "The tunnel was built by my great-grandfather, someone no one talks about anymore. His name was Keanu Reeves, and he was involved in something. I don't know how to explain it, but what I do know is that it was dark, very dark. He had connections to powerful people, people who would do anything to protect their secrets." Michelle felt a chill creep down her spine as she processed his words. "What kind of connections? What exactly did your great-grandfather do?" Keanu hesitated, as if the words were too heavy for him to speak. Samuel was involved in something much bigger than himself. Some kind of society. A secret organization with roots stretching back centuries. They believed in controlling the flow of information, gathering knowledge that others couldn't access. They created this tunnel system under the villa to protect certain artifacts, objects of power. "Artifacts of power?" Michelle echoed, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to piece everything together. "You mean, these objects are dangerous?" Keanu nodded, his eyes dark with something that looked like fear. "Yes. I don't know what they are, detective, but I've heard whispers of people searching for them, people who would stop at nothing to get their hands on whatever my great-grandfather left behind." Michelle's mind was spinning now. The mysterious photographs, the strange documents, the symbols on the walls of the tunnel. They were all connected to something bigger than Keanu, bigger than anyone had anticipated. She had walked into a world of secrets and lies, and now she was in too deep to turn back. "Why didn't you tell anyone about the tunnel?" she asked. "Why keep it hidden all these years?" Keanu's expression darkened further, his gaze distant. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what I might find. Afraid that I'd be dragged into something that I couldn't escape from. But now, detective, I think it's already too late." Michelle's heart raced. "Too late? What do you mean?" Keanu's face twisted with frustration. "Because people are looking for those artifacts right now. People who have been watching me for years, waiting for me to uncover what my great-grandfather left behind. They know I've been poking around in the tunnel, and they won't stop until they get what they want." The air in the room felt colder now, and Michelle could feel the weight of Keanu's words pressing down on her. This wasn't just a matter of solving a mystery, it was about survival. Keanu had been caught in the crosshairs of something ancient, something dark that stretched far beyond his understanding. And now, Michelle was too. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both she and Keanu froze. The sound of the knock echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that sounded far too purposeful to be a mere visitor. Keanu's eyes widened. "They found us," he whispered, panic flickering across his face for the first time. Michelle immediately reached for her gun, her instincts kicking in. Who's coming?" Keanu's expression hardened. "The people who want the artifacts. They've been tracking me for years, ever since I found out about the tunnel. And now that we're this close to the truth, they won't let us walk away." The doorbell rang again, this time louder. A voice, muffled but clear, echoed from the other side. Keanu Reeves, a deep, gravelly voice called out. "We know you're in there. Open the door." Michelle's pulse quickened as she realized that whoever was on the other side wasn't just looking for answers, they were looking for something much more dangerous. "Stay behind me," she instructed Keanu, her grip tightening on her weapon. She wasn't sure who was at the door, but she knew one thing. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Keanu nodded, his face ashen, but his jaw set in a determined line. "I'll open it, but only if you're ready for whatever comes next. Michelle gave him a nod, steeling herself for what was to come. She didn't know if they were ready for what lay beyond that door, but she knew that the next few moments could change everything. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, like a hammer striking an anvil. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she kept her grip tight on her gun, the cold metal steady against her palm. Keanu stood behind her, his face pale, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Whatever was about to happen next, neither of them was prepared for it. Not fully. The voice from the other side grew more insistent. Keanu, open the door. You can't hide forever. Michelle motioned for Keanu to step back, her instincts telling her that the situation was escalating fast. She moved toward the door cautiously, her ears straining to catch any sound, any sign of the intruder's intentions. She didn't know who was behind that door, but they had a tone that was all too familiar, the kind of voice you hear when someone thinks they have the upper hand. "Stay down," she whispered to Keanu. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he nodded, his lips pressed tight. He knew better than to question her judgment now. Michelle approached the door with caution, her movements deliberate. She flicked her wrist, checking the peephole, but saw nothing, only the shadow of the menacing presence outside. A chill ran down her spine. Without a word, Michelle cracked the door open just enough to speak to the person on the other side. "Who's asking?" she demanded, her voice firm, but her heart hammering against her ribcage. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the voice returned, a low growl of impatience. "You're the detective, aren't you? The one investigating the tunnel. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Her hand tightened on the door handle as she looked back at Keanu, whose eyes were now wide with fear, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. A flicker of recognition. He knew these people. She could feel the tension in the air crackle as the figure on the other side of the door continued speaking. "You know who we are, Keanu. Don't act like you've forgotten." The voice now had an edge to it, like a blade sharpening in the dark. Michelle's mind raced. She needed answers, answers that didn't come from cryptic threats. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her voice edged with authority as she pushed the door open just slightly more, her body angled to shield Keanu from view. The voice on the other side laughed, a cold, menacing laugh that sent shivers down Michelle's spine. "You'll find out soon enough. But first, we need Keanu. Step aside, or things might get complicated." Michelle's mind was working overtime, piecing together the fragments of Keanu's cryptic warnings. Who were these people? Why was Keanu so terrified of them? The reality of the situation hit her all at once. These weren't just ordinary thugs. No, these people were part of something much deeper, something connected to the artifacts Keanu had spoken of. She glanced at Keanu once more, noting the fear etched in his face. It was no longer just about the past, it was about survival. Before she could respond, the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "We know what's in that tunnel, Keanu, and we're not leaving until we get what we came for." Keanu flinched, stepping backward. "I told you, I don't know where it is. I haven't found it. He stopped himself, realizing what he was saying. His words hung in the air like a confession, and Michelle could see the panic in his eyes. He was caught between telling the truth and hiding the only thing that could save him. Michelle didn't have time to analyze every word. The door, which she had only cracked open, was suddenly forced forward with a violent shove. She barely had time to react before the door swung wide open, slamming against the wall with a resounding crash. Standing there, framed in the doorway, were two men. Both were tall, dressed in dark suits, their eyes hard and cold. They looked like they belonged in a different world, a world of shadows and secrets that Michelle had never known. One of the men stepped forward, his eyes locked on Keanu. "Enough games, Reeves. We're not here to negotiate. You know what we want." Keanu took a step back, his face drained of color. "I don't know where it is," he said again, though his voice trembled. "I swear, I haven't found anything." The man narrowed his eyes. "Lying to us won't help you, Keanu. We've been watching you for a long time. Ever since you started snooping around in the tunnel, we've known that the time was coming. But you, He paused, a slow smile spreading across his face. You can't escape your destiny. Michelle's mind was racing now, trying to piece together what was happening. These men weren't just ordinary criminals. They were part of something much larger, something that connected Keanu's family to a dark and dangerous legacy. She had seen it in the documents, the old photographs, the cryptic symbols. And now, it was clear that Keanu's secret wasn't just about old artifacts. It was about power, power that these men were willing to kill for. Michelle couldn't let them have Keanu. She couldn't let them get their hands on whatever was hidden beneath this villa. She had to act fast. With one swift motion, she pulled her gun from its holster and aimed it directly at the two men. Stay back, she ordered, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. I'm not afraid to use this. The two men exchanged glances, but neither flinched. They had seen it all before. You don't understand, detective, one of them said, his voice smooth as silk. This isn't about you. This is about something much bigger. You're out of your depth. Leave now, or we will have no choice but to take you with us. Michelle stood firm, her gun unwavering. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is he. For a long moment, neither side moved. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then, suddenly, Keanu stepped forward. No, he said, his voice firm. I'll go with you. I won't let anyone else get hurt. Michelle's stomach twisted. Keanu, don't. But it was too late. The two men were already closing in on him. With one final glance at Michelle, Keanu spoke again, his voice quieter this time. They won't stop, detective. They'll kill everyone if I don't go with them. It's the only way. Before she could say another word, the men grabbed Keanu by the arms, pulling him toward the door. Michelle's mind screamed at her to act, but she was outnumbered, and Keanu was right. If she didn't let them take him, there was no telling what they'd do. In that moment, the weight of the situation hit her like a freight train. Keanu wasn't just a man caught in a mystery. He was the key to something far bigger. And now, she had no choice but to follow him into the abyss. The sound of the heavy door closing behind Keanu was like a final, irrevocable echo in Michelle's mind. The moment the men dragged him away, the tension in the villa seemed to dissipate, leaving behind an empty, foreboding silence. Michelle stood frozen in the doorway, her gun still raised, her heart hammering in her chest, but the men were already gone. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The situation had gone from bad to worse in an instant, and now she was standing in the middle of it, feeling like a spectator to her own actions. She had failed to stop them. Worse, Keanu had surrendered to them willingly. Why? She couldn't fathom it. There had to be more to this story, something Keanu wasn't telling her. She had seen the fear in his eyes, but also something else, a resignation, as though he believed this was inevitable, that he couldn't outrun whatever force was pursuing him. Michelle's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket. She yanked it out, hoping for something, anything, that could guide her forward. The screen lit up with a text message from her partner, Officer Jacob Price. They're already moving in on the villa. Backup's on the way. Get out of there now. We'll cover you. Michelle didn't hesitate. She shoved her phone back into her pocket and ran toward the front door, but as she stepped outside, she skidded to a halt. A black SUV was parked in front of the villa, its engine running. Through the tinted windows, she could make out a man sitting inside, watching her. His expression was impassive, but there was a sense of cold calculation in his gaze. She instinctively reached for her gun again, but she didn't pull it out. Instead, she stepped closer to the car, her eyes locked on the man inside. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with underlying fury. The man didn't answer right away. He just studied her, as though evaluating whether she was a threat. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You've been asking too many questions, Detective Harris. Questions that don't concern you." "I'm not backing off," she replied firmly. "You've taken Keanu. I'm not going to let you get away with whatever this is." The man's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile. "Get away with? No, Detective. We're not hiding from anything. We're doing what needs to be done. And you're in the way." Michelle narrowed her eyes. And what is it that you're doing? What's going on under this villa? What do you want with Keanu? The man finally opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the early morning light. He was well-dressed, like the others who had taken Keanu, but his demeanor was different, calmer, more controlled. He seemed to have the air of someone who was used to having the upper hand. "You're asking the wrong questions, detective," he said, his voice still cool. "You should be asking yourself how deep you're willing to go. You're already involved, whether you like it or not." Michelle's pulse quickened. She knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a labyrinth, and she had been pulled into its center. Every question she had asked had only drawn her further into the darkness, and now there was no way out. "I'm not backing down," she said again, more forcefully this time. "I'll find Keanu, and I'll make sure you all answer for what you've done." The man stared at her for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had been expecting her to say exactly that. "Very well. You'll follow the trail, detective. But know this, the more you dig, the more you'll learn. And once you know the truth, you'll have no choice but to make a decision." Michelle felt a pang of unease, but her determination hardened. She wasn't about to be intimidated. "And if I refuse to make that decision?" she asked. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something more dangerous in his eyes, something that promised she would regret pushing too far. "Then you'll understand just how far we've gone to keep this secret, and how far we're willing to go to protect it." The coldness of his words hit her like a slap. Without another word, he turned and walked back to the SUV, leaving Michelle standing in the driveway, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. As the car drove away, Michelle stood frozen for a moment longer, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. The pieces were coming together, but they made no sense. Everything was tangled up in a mess of ancient secrets, powerful people, and a man named Keanu Reeves who, it seemed, was at the center of it all. Michelle didn't have time to think about the danger now. The clock was ticking, and Keanu was in the hands of whoever these people were. She needed to find him. Fast. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Jacob. "Michelle, what the hell happened?" "We're here. Where are you?" "I'm still at the villa," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "But Keanu's gone. They took him, and they won't stop until they get whatever's hidden beneath this place." Jacob cursed under his breath. "We're coming to you now. Stay put." Michelle didn't wait for him to say more. She hung up and turned back toward the villa. There was something she had missed, something that was still buried in the hidden tunnel beneath Keanu's home. Her mind flashed back to the symbols she had seen, the old photographs of Keanu's family, the vague references to an ancient society. She didn't have the answers yet, but she would find them. She had no other choice. And no matter what it took, she would get Keanu back. The drive back to the villa was a blur. Michelle's mind was working overtime, piecing together every clue she'd gathered so far. Keanu, the tunnel, the men in dark suits, the artifacts, the symbols, and most importantly, the ancient society that seemed to be pulling the strings. There was no doubt about it anymore. The situation was far bigger than just a missing person case. This was a covert operation, something buried in history, with dangerous people willing to kill to keep their secrets intact. By the time she arrived at the villa, the familiar feeling of unease had settled into the pit of her stomach. The last time she had been here, she'd been with Keanu, and now it felt different. Cold. Empty. The threat looming over the place was palpable, like a dark cloud waiting to burst. She parked her car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoing in the silence. A few moments later, Jacob's car screeched to a halt beside hers, and he was out of the vehicle in an instant, his eyes scanning the area with the vigilance of someone who knew danger when he saw it. "Any sign of them?" he asked, his voice sharp. Michelle shook her head, her eyes darting around the property. The tension in her body had only intensified since she'd seen the SUV leave. "No, but they're watching this place. I know it." Jacob followed her gaze, but he didn't argue. Instead, he crossed his arms and sighed. "All right, so what's the plan? You said they took Keanu. Any idea where they've gone? Michelle clenched her jaw, trying to push back the overwhelming sense of urgency that had been consuming her since they'd taken him. She thought about the words the man had said, "Follow the trail." The thing that bothered her the most wasn't just that Keanu was in danger. It was that, despite everything she had seen and heard, she didn't know what that trail looked like. There's got to be something we're missing, Jacob. Some clue. Something hidden in plain sight, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Jacob's expression softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this, Michelle. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax just a little. She was grateful for his support, but she knew time was running out. She couldn't afford to lose focus. She turned and began heading back toward the villa. Let's check the tunnel again, she said, her voice firm with resolve. Keanu said his great-grandfather built it, and we know it's linked to these people. There's something down there. We just have to find it. Jacob nodded, falling into step beside her. Together, they made their way down the stone path toward the hidden entrance to the tunnel. The air felt colder now, as though the villa itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to uncover what had been buried for so long. Michelle pushed open the door to the basement and descended into the darkness once again, the familiar scent of old wood and dust filling her nostrils. They reached the entrance of the tunnel, and she hesitated, her flashlight flickering as she scanned the walls. She had already been through this place once, but now there was a new urgency in her movements, a feeling that if they didn't uncover the truth now, they might never have another chance. Jacob stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the markings on the walls. You know, he said quietly, this place doesn't seem right. It feels like we're being watched. Michelle nodded without saying anything. She felt it too. It wasn't just the claustrophobic nature of the tunnel that made her uneasy. It was the overwhelming sense that they were being drawn deeper into something they weren't meant to understand. This is it, she said softly, pointing to one of the walls, where the strange symbols were etched deep into the stone. Keanu said they were connected to the artifacts. We know these symbols are important. Jacob crouched down beside her, examining the markings more closely. Could be part of some code, he muttered. But how the hell are we supposed to figure it out? Michelle's mind was working furiously. These symbols weren't random. They had to mean something. She ran her fingers over one of the symbols, the rough texture of the stone beneath her skin sending a shiver through her. Suddenly, her flashlight beam flickered once more, and she caught sight of something. An indentation in the wall, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was just below the strange markings, a small, circular depression that seemed to be beckoning her to touch it. Wait a minute, Michelle whispered. She reached forward and pressed her hand into the indentation. The wall shifted with a soft click, and before she could react, a section of the stone wall slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. Jacob took a step back, eyes wide with disbelief. What the hell? Michelle was already moving through the opening, her heart pounding with anticipation. She didn't know what was beyond the wall, but she knew it was the key to everything. Keanu had been right about this place. It wasn't just a tunnel. It was a hidden path leading to something far greater. Inside the passageway, the air grew colder, the stone walls slick with moisture. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for both of them to walk side by side. As they moved deeper into the passage, Michelle felt the weight of the secrets pressing in on them. Suddenly, they reached another small chamber, the walls covered in faded murals. The images were worn and hard to make out, but there were some things Michelle could make out clearly. Symbols she had seen before, and at the center of them all, a large stone altar. She approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight illuminating its surface. It was old, ancient, even, but there was something disturbingly familiar about it. The symbols on the altar matched the ones on the walls, and in the center of the altar was a small, perfectly round indentation, as though something had once been placed there. This is it, Michelle murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. This is what they were protecting. Jacob looked at her, confusion and concern written all over his face. What is this, Michelle? What are we looking at? Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the tunnel, a noise that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Someone else was down there with them. The sound of footsteps echoed off the stone walls, growing louder with each passing second. Michelle's heart skipped a beat, her senses heightening as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned to Jacob, her eyes wide with warning. "Get back," she hissed, her voice low. "Stay behind me." Jacob's eyes flashed with the same sense of urgency, but there was no time to discuss strategy. The footsteps were getting closer, deliberate, slow. Whoever it was, they were drawing near. And there was no question about it. Michelle and Jacob were not alone in the tunnel anymore. Michelle's grip tightened on her flashlight, its beam casting shaky, erratic light against the ancient stone walls. She stepped back, pushing Jacob behind her as they retreated into the shadows. The walls of the passageway felt like they were closing in, but there was no escape. If whoever was coming down that tunnel found them, they would be trapped. The footsteps grew louder. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the passage, emerging from the darkness like a specter. Michelle's pulse quickened, and for a moment, she froze. The person was tall, cloaked in a long, dark coat that obscured their face. All she could make out were the faintest glints of cold, calculating eyes that shone from beneath the shadow of the hood. It was a woman. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. The woman's presence was unnerving, almost supernatural. She moved with an eerie grace, her footsteps silent as she approached the altar, her eyes never leaving Michelle's. "Did you think you could hide from us?" the woman said, her voice soft, yet laced with an undeniable menace. There was a sharpness in her tone that made Michelle's skin crawl. Michelle's mind raced. Who was this woman? And why did she seem so calm, in control? This wasn't the reaction Michelle had expected. She had anticipated confrontation. An attack, maybe, but this woman seemed more like someone who already knew what was going to happen. "We weren't hiding," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. "We were investigating. This place, this altar, it's connected to everything, isn't it? The symbols, the tunnel, the artifacts." The woman's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you've uncovered a mystery, detective? This is no ordinary investigation. You are standing on the edge of something far greater than you realize." Jacob, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his hand still resting on his gun. "What do you want with us? Who are you?" The woman's eyes flicked over to him, sizing him up. "I am a messenger," she replied coolly, "a keeper of the old ways. And as for you, Detective Harris, you have been digging into things that should have remained buried. Things that were never meant to be uncovered." Michelle's mind reeled. A keeper of the old ways? Was she talking about some sort of secret society? Everything they had found so far, the tunnel, the altar, the symbols, was part of something ancient, something hidden. But what was its purpose? "What is it you're protecting?" Michelle asked, her voice unwavering. "What are you after?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a step closer to the altar, her eyes scanning the chamber as if evaluating the room, like the answers were written in the stone. Her fingers grazed the surface of the altar before she turned back to Michelle. "It's not what I am after," the woman said, her voice low and almost detached. "It's what you are after. You've awakened something, detective, and now you must decide. Will you continue down this path, or will you walk away before it's too late?" Michelle's stomach twisted. The woman's words felt like a warning, but Michelle knew she couldn't turn back now. The clues had led her this far, and she couldn't abandon Keanu. Not when she was this close to understanding the full scope of what was happening. "I'm not walking away," Michelle said firmly, her gaze never leaving the woman's. "I won't stop until I find Keanu and expose whatever this is." The woman's gaze softened, just for a moment, before a cold smirk appeared on her lips. "Very well. But be warned, detective, the deeper you go, the harder it will be to climb back out. There are forces here that will stop at nothing to protect what's hidden." As she spoke, Michelle's flashlight flickered once again, casting shadows that seemed to dance around the chamber. The woman stepped back into the darkness, her figure blending into the shadows until all that remained was the faint sound of her soft, deliberate footsteps retreating. Michelle and Jacob stood there, frozen, unsure of what had just transpired. The woman had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but her chilling words. "I don't like this," Jacob muttered under his breath. "We need to get out of here." Michelle hesitated, but her resolve remained firm. "No, we're not leaving. Not yet." She turned her attention back to the altar, her mind racing with possibilities. The woman had given them a choice: walk away or continue. But for Michelle, there was no turning back now. Not after everything she had seen, everything Keanu had been dragged into. Jacob watched her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if we're in over our heads, but we're too deep to stop now, aren't we?" Michelle met his gaze. "We're in this together, and we're going to finish it." Together, they moved closer to the altar once more. This time, Michelle's fingers brushed the edge of the stone, tracing the same symbols that were etched into the walls of the tunnel. It felt like a key, like the last piece of a puzzle they were almost ready to complete. As Michelle stood there, her mind racing, the weight of the woman's words hung in the air. "The deeper you go, the harder it will be to climb back out." But it was already too late for that. They had already crossed the line. There was no going back. The air in the tunnel felt thick with tension, as though the very walls were closing in on Michelle and Jacob. The mysterious woman had vanished, but her words echoed in Michelle's mind, growing louder with every passing second. "The deeper you go, the harder it will be to climb back out." Michelle clenched her fists at her sides. She had no choice but to press forward. The clues were here. Keanu was here. And whatever force these people represented, it was all connected. She wasn't about to walk away now. "We need to figure out what this altar means," she said, breaking the heavy silence between them. "What's hidden here? The symbols, the artifacts, there's a pattern we're missing." Jacob gave her a sharp look, but his tone softened. "I don't like this, Michelle. I've been a cop long enough to know when things are too far gone. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. It's something bigger, something dangerous." Michelle turned to face him, her jaw set with determination. "I didn't get into this job to back down when things got tough. Keanu needs us. And whatever this is, whatever they're hiding, if we don't find out now, we might never get another chance." Jacob sighed, looking conflicted. He wasn't exactly thrilled about continuing into the unknown, but Michelle's resolve was unwavering. "All right," he said finally, "but we're in this together. No more surprises." With that, the two of them moved closer to the altar. The ancient symbols etched into the stone were mesmerizing, their shapes both foreign and familiar. They seemed to shift under the dim light, almost as if they were alive. Michelle's fingers traced the symbols, her mind working overtime to make sense of them. "Keanu said something about these symbols being linked to his great-grandfather's history," Michelle muttered. "What if the answer is in the story of his family? What if they were part of this ancient society?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "You really think Keanu's family was involved in something like this?" "I don't know yet," Michelle said, standing back up and scanning the room. "But it's the only lead we have. Keanu's great-grandfather had to have known something about these artifacts. If we can trace his history, maybe we'll find the missing pieces to the puzzle." The faint sound of scurrying footsteps echoed down the tunnel, interrupting their thoughts. Michelle whipped around, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. "Someone's coming." Jacob stepped in front of her, his expression tense. "We need to get out of here. Fast." But Michelle hesitated. Her heart raced, and she felt the weight of the altar's mystery pressing down on her. There was something crucial here, something she could feel in her bones. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We can't leave without understanding what this is. Whoever is coming down that tunnel, we can handle them. But we need to know what we're dealing with first." Jacob looked uncertain, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no stopping her once she set her mind to something. Michelle stepped closer to the altar, her mind focused on the puzzle before her. She studied the symbols again, then moved her hand to the center of the stone structure. To her surprise, the stone beneath her fingers gave way with a soft rumble, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, she found a small, intricately carved box. Her breath caught. This was it, the object she had been searching for, the thing that had been hidden for generations. Michelle. Jacob's voice was strained, his eyes flicking nervously toward the tunnel entrance. But Michelle was already lifting the box, her heartbeat racing. The box was made of dark, polished wood, and it felt impossibly heavy in her hands. It was covered in the same cryptic symbols as the altar, and as she held it, she could feel a strange energy emanating from it. It was like the box was alive, pulsing with a power she couldn't yet understand. "Do you think this is what they were protecting?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Michelle didn't answer right away. She could barely tear her eyes away from the box. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. Something ancient. Something dangerous. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and this time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was coming, and they were close. "Time's up," Michelle muttered under her breath. She shoved the box into her bag and turned to Jacob. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly, retracing their steps toward the exit of the tunnel. The flickering light from their flashlights cast eerie shadows along the narrow walls, but Michelle was focused on one thing: getting out of there with the box and Keanu. As they emerged from the tunnel, the cool night air hit them like a slap to the face. But there was no time to savor the fresh air. They had to move fast. Whoever was pursuing them wouldn't give up easily. Michelle's eyes scanned the villa's surroundings. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in. They were no longer just investigators. They were involved in something much bigger, much darker. And Keanu? He was still missing, still in the hands of those who would do anything to keep their secret safe. "We need to get back to the station," Michelle said, her voice sharp. "We need to analyze the box, the symbols, everything. We have to find out what's inside." Jacob didn't respond, but his gaze was fixed ahead, his posture tense. He wasn't just worried about what was coming. He was worried about what they had already uncovered. As they reached their cars, a shadow moved in the distance. A figure in dark clothing. It was the last thing Michelle saw before she got in her car, slamming the door shut and starting the engine. "We need to move now," she shouted to Jacob, who quickly climbed into his own vehicle. Without another word, they sped off, the eerie silence of the villa behind them, but the creeping sense of danger following them every step of the way. The drive back to the station was a blur of adrenaline and racing thoughts. Michelle's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as the weight of what they had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. Every turn felt like they were being watched. Every glance in the rearview mirror gave her the sensation that someone was tailing them. The box was securely tucked under the seat, but the sense of danger followed them like an invisible shadow. Jacob remained silent next to her, his face set in grim determination. His jaw was clenched, eyes darting to the side every now and then, but neither of them spoke as they sped through the dark streets. Michelle's mind raced. The box, the symbols, the altar, it was all connected. But to what? And why had Keanu's great-grandfather hidden it beneath the villa? What did it all mean? There had to be a deeper purpose behind the secrecy. And now, with the box in their possession, they had a lead. But how far would it take them before someone came looking to take it back? They arrived at the station just before dawn, the first light of morning creeping over the horizon as Michelle parked her car. She felt the weight of exhaustion creeping up on her, but there was no time for rest. Not now. Not when they were so close to the truth. "Let's get to the lab," she said, voice low but determined. Jacob nodded, and the two of them moved swiftly into the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The lab was dimly lit, with an array of forensic equipment scattered across the counters. It felt sterile, clinical, a far cry from the strange, ancient mystery they had just unearthed. Michelle placed the box carefully on the table and stepped back. Her fingers itched to open it, to see what was inside. But she knew better than to rush. They needed to approach this methodically. "Do you think this will tell us everything we need to know?" Jacob asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "I don't know," Michelle admitted, "but it's the only lead we have. Whatever's inside this box could change everything." Jacob raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He knew better than to question Michelle's instincts, especially when they were this far in. They both understood that whatever came next, it would be far from ordinary. Michelle took a deep breath and began carefully inspecting the box. The carvings on its surface matched the ones from the altar and the tunnel, an intricate web of symbols that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. There was no latch, no obvious way to open it. She ran her fingers over the markings, her mind working to decipher their significance. "Do you think it's locked somehow?" Jacob asked, leaning over her shoulder. Michelle nodded. "Possibly. There has to be a mechanism. These symbols aren't just for decoration." She examined the box closely, looking for any hidden triggers or switches. It took a few moments of intense scrutiny, but finally, she found it, a faint indentation on the side of the box. She pressed it gently, and with a soft click, the lid popped open, revealing the contents inside. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside the box was a small, weathered book, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with the same symbols they had seen throughout the villa, the tunnel, and the altar. But what caught Michelle's attention was the faint glow emanating from the pages. Jacob stepped back, his eyes wide with surprise. "What the hell?" Michelle didn't answer. She was too mesmerized by the book to say anything. The glow wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable. There was something unnatural about it. She opened the book, flipping through the fragile pages, trying to make sense of what was written. The language was ancient, but somehow familiar, like it was just on the edge of her understanding. As she turned the pages, one section in particular caught her eye. It was a map. Not just any map, but a map of the villa, and what seemed like an even larger, more complex structure beneath it. Underground chambers, hidden pathways, and secret rooms that had never been discovered by the public. This is a map of the villa's underground system," Michelle whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "But it's more than that. There's something below it, something far larger." Jacob leaned in, peering over her shoulder. "What do you mean? More tunnels?" Michelle nodded, her finger tracing the map. "There's a whole network beneath us. This is just the surface. And this symbol here, it's the same one we saw on the altar." Her eyes widened in realization. This isn't just a hidden chamber. It's a sanctuary, a place where something has been guarded for centuries. Jacob looked at her, his face filled with concern. "What are we talking about, Michelle? What are they hiding down there?" Before Michelle could respond, the door to the lab swung open with a loud bang, and two uniformed officers entered, their expressions stern. "Detective Miller, we need to talk." Michelle's stomach dropped. She had been so absorbed in the book, in the map, that she hadn't heard them approach. There was no denying it now. The tension in the air was palpable. Something was wrong. "About what?" Michelle asked, trying to keep her voice steady. One of the officers stepped forward, his face grim. "About the man in the alley. The one you were questioning before. He's gone. And his car. It's missing too." Michelle's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, gone?" The officer hesitated, then glanced at his partner. "He's not just gone. His body's been taken, and there are signs of a struggle. It's clear that whoever took him didn't just kill him. They took him for a reason. And we think it's tied to what you're investigating." Michelle's heart pounded in her chest. "We need to go. Now." She shoved the book into her bag and turned to Jacob. "We're not alone in this. Whoever they are, they're closing in. They know we're onto them." Jacob nodded, grabbing his gun from the desk drawer. "Let's go." As they rushed out of the lab, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whoever had taken the man was likely the same group who had been behind Keanu's abduction. And if they were willing to kill and disappear without a trace, Michelle knew they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. They had just scratched the surface, and now the real danger was about to unfold. The weight of the missing man's disappearance hung heavily in the air as Michelle and Jacob sped through the streets, their destination clear but the road ahead uncertain. Whoever was behind Keanu's abduction, and the violence that followed, wasn't going to stop. And now, with the officers' warning fresh in their minds, Michelle felt the familiar pulse of urgency that told her they were running out of time. "Do you think they know we have the book?" Jacob asked, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. Michelle glanced over at him, her expression hardening. "They must. We're not the only ones who have been searching for the truth beneath that villa. Whoever is after Keanu, they'll do whatever it takes to keep the secrets buried." Jacob grunted in agreement. We're in deeper than we thought. That book, the map, whatever's underground, it's far bigger than we first realized. Michelle's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. We have to find Keanu. Whatever they're hiding, it's tied to him. We're close to uncovering something dangerous, and I have a feeling the answers are in those underground chambers. They drove in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. The city outside the car window seemed distant, as if they were already in a different world. One where answers were buried deep beneath layers of history, deceit, and dark secrets. But as much as Michelle wanted to believe they could solve this, she knew that they were being watched. The more they dug, the more dangerous the game became. They pulled into a secluded parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse, far from the prying eyes of the public. Michelle shut off the engine and glanced at Jacob. We can't risk being followed anymore. We'll head into the tunnels tonight. The map shows a way in, but we need to be careful. We don't know what's waiting down there. Jacob nodded. His eyes narrowed in thought. I don't like the idea of walking into a trap. We don't even know what we're dealing with. We're going anyway, Michelle said firmly, her resolve unshaken. Keanu's down there, and so is the truth. We need to be one step ahead of them, or we'll lose him. We're not backing out now. Jacob stared at her for a moment, his mouth tightening as if he wanted to argue. But after a beat, he exhaled heavily, as if coming to a decision. All right, let's do it. But we stick together. And if anything goes sideways, we get the hell out of there, no questions asked. Michelle gave a sharp nod. Understood. The two of them made their way toward the warehouse's entrance, moving cautiously as they crossed the dimly lit parking lot. The chill of the night air nipped at their skin, but Michelle's nerves were taut, her thoughts focused solely on the task ahead. They were about to descend into a place where time itself had been forgotten, and the dangers they faced could be far more lethal than they had anticipated. They reached the back door of the warehouse and slipped inside. The air inside was musty and stale, as though the building had been abandoned for years. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the silence felt unnatural. Everything about this place screamed secrecy. Michelle and Jacob moved through the warehouse, carefully avoiding the creaking floorboards. They reached the far corner of the building, where a large metal door was barely visible behind a pile of crates and old furniture. The map had indicated this location, and as Michelle studied the door, she could see the faintest outline of a hidden passageway beneath it. I think we found it, she whispered, running her fingers along the edge of the door. This is it, the way in. Jacob shifted nervously, his eyes scanning the dark space around them. Let's make it quick. Michelle nodded, and with a quick motion, she pushed the door open. It creaked, then groaned as it swung wide, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. For a moment, Michelle hesitated. She could feel the weight of history pressing on her as she looked down into the unknown. This wasn't just about Keanu anymore. It was about something far greater, something that had been hidden for generations. Stay close, Michelle said, stepping onto the staircase. Jacob followed without hesitation, his hand resting on his gun, ready for anything. They descended slowly, their flashlights casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the musty scent of earth and old stone thickening as they moved further into the depths. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a large stone door, its surface covered in more of the same symbols from the altar and the box. This door, however, looked far older. It had been untouched for centuries, its surface smooth and worn by time. This is it, Michelle whispered, her voice reverberating in the quiet chamber. Whatever is behind this door, it's the key. Jacob stepped forward cautiously. Do you think they're waiting for us on the other side? Michelle didn't answer right away. She reached out, tracing the symbols carved into the door. It felt like the stone itself was alive, like the door had a pulse. With a sudden movement, Michelle pressed one of the symbols. There was a deep rumbling sound as the stone door slowly began to slide open, revealing a vast, dark chamber beyond. A chill ran down Michelle's spine as she peered into the depths of the room. Ready? She asked, turning to Jacob. He didn't hesitate. Let's go. They stepped into the chamber, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The space was enormous, larger than any room they had encountered before. The air was thick with dust, and the stone walls seemed to stretch endlessly into the blackness. And in the center of the room, there was a large, ancient-looking stone pedestal. As Michelle and Jacob cautiously approached, they saw that something was placed on the pedestal, a large, sealed urn, covered in more symbols. The energy in the room seemed to shift as they got closer. It was like the very air was charged, vibrating with some ancient power. "What is this?" Jacob muttered, his voice filled with awe. Michelle stepped closer, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the urn. Her fingers brushed against the cold stone, and she felt a strange pull. Something was calling her to open it. But as her hand hovered over the urn, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far side of the room. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. The footsteps grew louder, echoing ominously in the cavernous room. Michelle's heart raced, and her grip on the urn tightened. Her eyes darted around the vast chamber, searching for any sign of who, or what, was approaching. "Stay close," she whispered to Jacob, barely audible over the thudding of her pulse. Her mind was racing with possibilities. Had they been followed? Or had the people behind Keanu's disappearance anticipated their every move? Jacob nodded, his expression unreadable, but Michelle could tell he was just as on edge as she was. They weren't just dealing with a missing person anymore. They were in the heart of something dark and dangerous, something that had been hidden for centuries. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the air grew thick with tension. Michelle's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the shadows at the far side of the room. At first, she couldn't make out much, just the outline of a tall figure cloaked in darkness. The low, guttural voice that followed sent a chill down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, his words heavy with a strange, unplaceable accent. Michelle's instinct screamed for her to be ready, but she forced herself to remain calm. There was a power in the air, a presence that seemed to consume the very room. The figure moved closer, his face finally coming into view under the dim light of their flashlights. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intensity. His skin was pale, and his features sharp, almost too perfect. His presence was suffocating, like he had stepped out of the very walls of the chamber. "I don't know who you are, but if you're here to stop us from uncovering the truth, then you're too late," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread in her chest. The man didn't respond immediately. He simply studied her, his cold eyes calculating. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped forward, crossing the space between them in a matter of seconds. "You think this is about truth?" he asked, his voice colder than ice. "You think you can just walk into a place like this and uncover what has been kept secret for centuries?" Michelle's grip on her gun tightened, but she didn't draw it. Not yet. She had to stay calm, to figure out who he was and what his intentions were. The man seemed familiar, but she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. "Who are you?" Jacob asked, his voice tense but resolute. The man smirked, an unsettling gleam in his eyes. "I am the keeper of secrets," he said cryptically, "and I am here to make sure those secrets stay buried." Michelle's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Keeper of secrets? The phrase felt like it meant something more than just a title. It was a warning. "Why have you been watching us?" Michelle demanded, stepping forward, her stance unwavering. "Why did you take Keanu?" The man's smile faltered for just a moment, and it was enough to make Michelle's heart skip a beat. The flicker of surprise in his eyes was brief but telling. "Keanu Reeves is merely a tool in a larger game," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "He doesn't know it, but his fate has been sealed long before you ever got involved." Michelle's stomach twisted. What was he talking about? A tool? For whom? And why had Keanu's great-grandfather been involved in this ancient web of secrets? "Are you working for someone?" Jacob asked, his eyes narrowing, but the man only chuckled darkly. "Working for someone?" He shook his head slowly, as though the idea amused him. "I am the one who controls the game, not a player in it. This isn't just about Keanu. This is about something much bigger, something far older." Michelle's mind churned with the man's cryptic words. She had thought she was on the verge of uncovering the truth about Keanu's disappearance, but now she felt as if they were standing on the precipice of something far darker, something that went beyond a simple missing person case. Enough with the riddles, Michelle snapped, trying to keep her frustration in check. What is this place? And what does it have to do with Keanu's family? The man's smile returned, but this time, it was full of cold malice. This place is the key to unlocking a power you can't even begin to understand. It's the source of everything, the power that's been passed down through generations. The bloodline of Keanu's family is just one small piece in a much larger puzzle. And when it's complete, the world will never be the same. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? What power are you talking about? The man stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. There are things beneath the surface of this world, things that have been hidden for centuries, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now, that moment is almost here. Keanu is part of that moment. But you... He stopped, his gaze shifting toward the urn on the pedestal, his expression turning darker. You should never have opened that. You've just unleashed something far worse than you can imagine. Michelle's pulse hammered in her chest as she looked down at the urn. It had been the source of their search, her sole focus for weeks, but now, she felt as though they had stumbled into something much bigger than they could have ever expected. Worse than what? Jacob asked, his voice strained as he stepped in front of Michelle, his eyes locked on the man. The keeper of secrets smiled again, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of something far more sinister. You'll find out soon enough. Before either Michelle or Jacob could react, the man moved in a blur of motion, vanishing into the shadows of the chamber. His presence seemed to dissipate in an instant, leaving them standing in stunned silence. What just happened? Jacob whispered, his voice shaken. I don't know, Michelle muttered, staring at the empty space where the man had been. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Keanu, the box, the urn, the symbols, they were all tied together. But how? And why had the man spoken of a power so ancient, so dangerous? The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she knew one thing for sure. They were in over their heads. Whoever, or whatever, had been watching them from the shadows had just made it clear that they were willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. And now, Michelle had to make a choice. Continue digging for the truth, or walk away before it consumed them all. Michelle's breath came in sharp gasps as she scanned the empty chamber. The man, whoever he was, had vanished into the shadows with unsettling speed. It was as though he had never been there at all, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in his wake. Jacob's hand hovered near his gun, his knuckles white with tension. What just happened? He repeated, his voice tight, eyes darting around as if expecting the man to materialize from the darkness at any moment. Michelle didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the pedestal, where the urn sat in eerie silence. The air around them seemed to pulse, heavy with something unseen, something ancient. She could still hear the man's words echoing in her mind, the ominous warning about the power hidden beneath this villa. Do you think he was telling the truth? Jacob's voice cut through her thoughts, and she turned toward him, her gaze sharp. I don't know, she said, her voice low and steady despite the storm of uncertainty swirling inside her. But I know one thing, whatever's in that urn, it's more than we can handle. He wouldn't have reacted like that if it was just an old artifact. This is bigger. Jacob stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the urn as if drawn to it by some invisible force. What if he was just trying to scare us off? Michelle shook her head. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a warning. Like he knew exactly what would happen once we opened that urn. And that's what scares me. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of their breathing. Michelle could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They had come so far, traversing tunnels, uncovering secrets. But now, standing in this chamber with the urn before them, it felt like they had crossed a line from which there was no return. We have to open it, Michelle said suddenly, her voice firm with a sense of finality. We've come this far. If we don't, we might as well turn around now. Jacob looked at her, his expression conflicted. You heard what he said. You heard the way he talked about the power. Whatever's in there, it's not just a box. It's dangerous. I don't think we have a choice, Michelle replied, her gaze unwavering. If Keanu is really part of this, if he's tied to whatever this power is, we need to understand it. We need to know what's at stake. Otherwise, we'll be flying blind. And we can't afford that. There was a long pause as Jacob considered her words. He glanced at the urn, then back at Michelle, his face hardening with resolve. All right, he said finally, voice steady. Let's do it. But we need to be careful. Whatever happens next, we don't know what we're dealing with. Michelle nodded. I know. Together, they approached the pedestal, the weight of their decision hanging over them like a dark cloud. The symbols on the urn glowed faintly in the dim light of their flashlights, as if inviting them to unlock its secrets. Michelle reached out, her hand trembling ever so slightly. She placed her fingers on the urn's cold surface, and for a moment, nothing happened. It was as though the urn was waiting for something, for a trigger to set it in motion. The atmosphere around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the world itself was waiting for them to make the next move. With a deep breath, Michelle twisted the lid of the urn. It came off easily, far too easily, as though it had been waiting to be opened. The air around them seemed to shift as the lid fell away, revealing the contents inside. At first, it was just a small, hollowed stone. But as Michelle reached for it, she felt the unmistakable hum of power, like static electricity running through her fingers. The stone was warm to the touch, almost uncomfortably so. It had a strange, smooth surface, unlike any stone she'd ever seen. What is this? Jacob whispered, staring at the object in Michelle's hand. She didn't answer right away. She was too focused on the stone, the way it seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. It was almost as if it was alive, as if it had a purpose, a power far beyond human understanding. Then, without warning, the stone cracked open in Michelle's hand. The sound was faint at first, like a soft snap, but it was enough to make Michelle freeze. The stone split down the middle, revealing a small, intricate key inside. The key was made of an unfamiliar metal, its surface etched with the same cryptic symbols that had been carved into the walls of the villa and the box they had found earlier. It was ancient, yet impossibly intact, as if it had been preserved through time for a singular purpose. As Michelle held the key, she felt a sudden surge of understanding. It was like a flood of memories, or perhaps just a knowing, filling her mind. This was the key to something far greater, something that had been hidden for generations. Do you feel that? Michelle whispered, her voice trembling with realization. Jacob stepped closer, his eyes wide. Yeah, it's like it's pulling at me, like it's calling us. Michelle nodded, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing that they were standing on the edge of something far beyond their control. Suddenly, a low rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, as if the very ground beneath them was shifting. The walls seemed to tremble, and the air grew thick with an energy Michelle couldn't describe. Get ready, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something's happening. Before they could react, a series of deep, resonant tones filled the room, as if an ancient mechanism had been activated. The floor beneath their feet began to shake, and a hidden door in the far wall slid open with a loud groan, revealing a dark passageway beyond. Michelle and Jacob exchanged a look, the weight of what they had just uncovered settling heavily between them. The key they had found was not just a symbol of power. It was a signal that something far more dangerous was about to be unleashed. We have to go, Michelle said urgently, her heart pounding in her chest. We've opened the door. Now we need to follow it. Jacob nodded, pulling his gun from its holster. Lead the way. With the key in Michelle's hand and the unknown passage before them, they stepped forward. As they walked into the darkness, the rumbling beneath them continued, and Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just uncovering a mystery. They were about to become part of something far larger and far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The chamber behind them grew eerily silent, save for the faint echoes of their footsteps and the persistent low rumbling that reverberated through the walls. The heavy stone door had slid open with an unnatural ease, revealing a dark passageway that stretched deep into the heart of the villa. Michelle's hand tightened around the key as they stepped into the darkness, the only light coming from their flashlights and the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. The air was thick with dust, carrying a scent of ancient stone and something far more ominous. A cold draft blew through the passageway, stirring the air and making the hairs on the back of Michelle's neck stand on end. "Do you feel that?" Jacob asked, his voice low, a tremor of unease in it. "It's like something's alive down here." Michelle didn't answer immediately. She was too focused on the path ahead, the key pulsing in her hand. It felt almost hungry, vibrating with an energy that seemed to seep into her very bones. Whatever had been hidden in these tunnels, it was clear now that they were walking deeper into something far older and far more dangerous than they had imagined. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being led into a trap. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, but the truth, the answer to everything, the key to Keanu's disappearance, to the power that lay buried beneath the villa, was just beyond reach. She had to keep moving. Jacob's eyes flickered nervously over his shoulder. What if this is what the man wanted? For us to open the urn and walk right into whatever this is. "We don't have a choice," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the chaos of her thoughts. "If Keanu is still alive, he's somewhere down here. And whatever it is we've unleashed, it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." The dark passageway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, winding deeper into the villa's forgotten bowels. As they continued forward, the air grew heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional groan of stone settling. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, symbols that Michelle didn't recognize but felt oddly familiar, as though they were written in a language long forgotten by time. "Do you think the man was telling the truth?" Jacob asked after a long pause, his voice tense. "About the power, I mean." He seemed pretty sure that this was all part of some bigger plan. Michelle hesitated. Her mind flashed back to the Keeper of Secrets, the man who had warned them, who had spoken of powers buried for centuries. The cryptic phrases, the strange way he'd looked at the urn, and the darkness in his eyes. It all felt like a warning, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had known far more than he had let on. "I think he's part of something bigger," Michelle said, her voice low. "I don't think we're the only ones searching for this power. And if Keanu is caught in the middle of it, we need to find him before it's too late." As they moved deeper into the passage, a strange humming noise began to reverberate through the walls. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each step they took. The humming had a strange rhythm to it, like a heartbeat or the distant pulse of some ancient machine that had been lying dormant for centuries. Michelle's grip on the key tightened, as though it were drawing her forward, urging her to keep going. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of what was ahead was pressing down on her, trying to stop her from reaching the end. And then, as if answering her unspoken question, the passage opened into a vast chamber, larger than any room they had seen before. The ceiling was high, stretching beyond the reach of their flashlights, and the walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with an eerie light. At the center of the room stood an altar, an ancient, stone structure that looked like it had been carved directly into the rock. On top of the altar was a pedestal, much like the one they had seen in the previous chamber, but this one was different. It was empty. Michelle's heart raced as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. It felt wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. The silence was deafening, but the humming noise had stopped. Everything in the chamber felt still, frozen in time. "What is this place?" Jacob murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think this is it," Michelle said, her voice thick with awe and fear. "This is the heart of whatever is hidden beneath the villa. And I think Keanu is somewhere close." Jacob's eyes darted around the chamber, his hand twitching toward his gun. "This feels wrong, Michelle. We're not alone." Michelle took a step closer to the altar, her senses on high alert. She felt the weight of the key in her hand, as though it were guiding her toward the altar. Her eyes locked on the empty pedestal, and the unsettling realization hit her like a cold wave. Whatever had been here before, whatever power had been guarded for centuries, was now gone. As if on cue, The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A low rumbling sound filled the chamber, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in rhythm with the deep vibration of the earth beneath them. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. It's a mechanism. This whole place is some kind of machine. Before she could process the thought fully, the altar suddenly shifted. The stone slabs slid apart with an ear-splitting screech, revealing a narrow shaft descending into the depths below. "What the hell is that?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with disbelief as he stared at the opening. Michelle didn't answer. She was already moving toward the shaft. There was no turning back now. They had uncovered the first piece of a much larger puzzle, and if they didn't act quickly, they might never get the chance to finish it. "This is it," she said, voice firm despite the gnawing fear in her chest. "We have to go down. Keanu's down there. We have to find him." Jacob hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering from the shaft to Michelle. "And if this is another trap? What if we're walking straight into something we can't get out of?" Michelle looked down into the dark abyss, her breath catching in her throat. "Then we'll face it together." With one last glance at each other, they both descended into the dark shaft, their flashlights cutting through the thick blackness below. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, and the sensation of being watched intensified with each step they took. The deeper they went, the more Michelle could feel it, the power. It was like a force pulling them forward, urging them towards something waiting in the dark, something that would change everything. But what that something was, she didn't know yet, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to find out. The shaft seemed to stretch forever, its walls slick with moisture, as Michelle and Jacob descended deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with every foot they dropped, and the echo of their footsteps was swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung around them. Michelle's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The deeper they went, the more that gnawing feeling of unease intensified. It wasn't just the darkness. They had encountered darkness before. It wasn't just the cold. Cold was a familiar companion. It was something else, something older, something waiting. The flashlight beams bounced off the wet stone walls, their light weak and jittery. It was as if the passage itself didn't want them to see too much, as if the tunnel was deliberately leading them somewhere they didn't belong. "Do you feel that?" Jacob's voice was tight with tension, like the walls are closing in or watching us. Michelle nodded, her grip on the key tightening instinctively. The sensation was impossible to ignore. It was as if the very air around them was alive, as if the earth itself were conscious. She knew they were getting close to something they weren't supposed to find. A distant noise, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical, reached her ears. It sent a shiver down her spine. Jacob's expression mirrored her own unease as they both froze in place, listening intently. "That's not just the wind," Michelle murmured, her eyes narrowing. "No," Jacob agreed quietly, his hand instinctively going for his gun. "That's something else." They continued down the shaft, their pace quickening despite the overwhelming feeling that they were being followed. The rhythmic noise grew louder, clearer, and they could now hear a soft hum, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. Finally, the shaft ended in a wide, cavernous space. The floor beneath them was uneven, cracked and jagged, and the temperature had dropped sharply. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and an eerie light seemed to emanate from the very walls, casting strange shadows that danced and twisted like specters in the dim glow of their flashlights. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. In the center of the cavern, perched upon a massive stone plinth, was a colossal, intricate structure. At first glance, it appeared to be some kind of mechanical device, but on closer inspection, Michelle realized it wasn't machinery at all. It was a monument, an ancient altar, designed with symbols that mirrored the ones they had seen throughout the villa. The structure seemed to hum with a power all its own, and the stone beneath their feet seemed to pulse in time with it. "Is that what I think it is?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I think it's the heart of whatever this place is," Michelle answered, her voice low with awe and dread. "This is where it all began. The power. The reason Keanu. Why we're even here." Jacob stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding walls. "This is bad, Michelle. This is bigger than anything we thought." Michelle was about to respond when she felt the air shift, a sudden draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The humming noise in the cavern grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet trembled, making her heart skip a beat. Then, without warning, the structure on the plinth began to move. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the floor, and the symbols on the walls lit up with an intense, blinding light. The stone beneath their feet cracked open, revealing an enormous set of double doors embedded into the cavern wall. For a long moment, Michelle just stood there, frozen, staring at the opening doors. Her mind raced. She knew that whatever was behind them was connected to everything they had uncovered. Keanu's disappearance, the strange man's cryptic warnings, the power hidden within the villa. This is it," she said, her voice hollow with the realization. "We're not just dealing with something old. We're dealing with something alive." "Alive?" Jacob echoed, his voice rising in disbelief. "What do you mean by that?" Michelle didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. It pulsed with heat, almost as though it were responding to the door opening. The feeling of being drawn toward the unknown grew stronger, like an irresistible force pulling her forward. Without thinking, she placed the key into a small, hidden slot at the base of the massive door. The moment her fingers made contact with the cold stone, the entire cavern seemed to shudder. The doors groaned and slowly began to open, revealing what lay beyond. Michelle's heart hammered in her chest as the doors parted, and what they revealed took her breath away. A vast, subterranean chamber stretched before them, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, but it wasn't the carvings that held her attention. It was the center of the room. In the middle of the cavern stood a towering structure, a monument unlike anything she had ever seen. It resembled a twisted amalgamation of stone, metal, and something far more alien, like a living, breathing thing. But it wasn't just the structure that caught her eye. It was the presence that surrounded it, the overwhelming, suffocating presence of something ancient, something powerful. Michelle took a hesitant step forward, and the moment she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to rumble again. The presence of whatever was in the chamber deepened, and the air grew thick with something electric, something ancient and alive. And then, in the distance, she saw him. Keanu Reeves. His figure stood at the foot of the structure, his back to them, silhouetted against the flickering, otherworldly light emanating from the machine. His body was stiff, unmoving, his face hidden in shadow. The sight of him stopped Michelle in her tracks. He looked like he was in a trance, like he had been consumed by whatever force held this place together. "Keanu," Michelle called out, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and fear. He didn't respond. "Keanu," she shouted again, stepping forward. Her heart raced, and the air around her seemed to hum with anticipation. The power in the room was suffocating, threatening to swallow her whole. Jacob hesitated, his gaze shifting between Michelle and the imposing structure. "We need to be careful," he warned. "This place, it's not what we thought. It's not just a hidden tomb. This is something far worse." But Michelle didn't hear him. She was already moving toward Keanu, every step pulling her closer to the heart of the power that had kept him captive for so long. And as she approached, she finally understood the true depth of the danger they were facing. Whatever had been waiting here, whatever ancient force was now awake, it was far more than they could have imagined. And it wanted them all. The air in the chamber was heavy, almost oppressive, as Michelle stepped closer to Keanu. Each step felt like she was walking through thick fog, the world around her distorting in a strange, unnatural way. The machine-like structure at the center of the room pulsed with an eerie light, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It was as if the very walls were alive, breathing with an ancient, malevolent energy. Keanu's figure remained motionless, standing like a statue before the towering structure. His back was still to them, his body stiff, almost unnatural. He didn't react to Michelle's calls, nor did he acknowledge their presence in any way. His silence was deafening, filling the cavern with an unsettling tension. "Keanu," Michelle whispered, more to herself than to him. Her heart raced in her chest. She wanted to run to him, to shake him and demand answers. But something held her back, an invisible force, like a barrier she couldn't cross. Jacob stood behind her, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. He, too, seemed mesmerized by the scene unfolding before them. "This doesn't feel right, Michelle," he murmured. "We shouldn't be here. None of this is what it seems." Michelle's eyes never left Keanu. His face was obscured in shadows, but she could still make out the familiar shape of him, the strong jawline, the unruly hair, the tall, imposing figure she had once known. But now, he looked different, hollow, like a shell of the man he had been. Suddenly, Keanu's body jerked, and Michelle's heart skipped a beat. He moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his head toward them. His eyes, now wide and empty, locked onto hers. "Keanu?" Michelle asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. She took a cautious step forward, but her movement was met with an overwhelming sense of resistance, as though the air itself was pushing her away. His lips parted, and for a moment, Michelle thought he was going to speak. But instead of words, a low, guttural sound escaped from him, something that wasn't quite a growl, but a vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. It sent a wave of unease through her, and her skin prickled with the unnaturalness of it. "Keanu," she tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his movements jerky, mechanical. His gaze never left her face, but there was no recognition in his eyes, only an empty, hollow stare that sent chills down Michelle's spine. Then, as though he were a puppet with its strings pulled, Keanu's head jerked back toward the strange structure. The pulsing light from the machine seemed to grow brighter, and the hum in the air intensified. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the rumbling of the earth. It was as if the very fabric of reality was shifting. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, thicker. "We need to get out of here," Jacob said urgently, grabbing Michelle's arm. "Now." Before he could finish his sentence, the ground cracked open beneath them. The cavern shook violently as if it were being torn apart. Michelle screamed as the floor beneath them split, sending a shockwave of dust and debris into the air. Her heart raced as she was thrown off balance, stumbling backward. Keanu didn't move. He just stood there, his body as still as ever, as if the chaos around him didn't affect him at all. His eyes locked onto the structure in the center of the room, the source of the dark power that pulsed through the chamber. Michelle's thoughts raced. Whatever had happened to Keanu, whatever force had taken hold of him, it was connected to that machine. The structure at the center of the room was not just an artifact. It was a gateway, a conduit, and Keanu was its vessel. The rumbling intensified, the noise deafening. The walls shook violently, and massive stones began to fall from the ceiling, crashing to the ground with thunderous force. The chamber was collapsing around them, but Keanu remained unmoving. "Michelle," Jacob shouted, pulling her back toward the far wall, away from the crumbling center of the room. "We have to go. Now." Michelle couldn't tear her gaze away from Keanu. She had to save him, but as she watched him, a terrible realization began to dawn on her. Keanu wasn't just a victim of whatever force was in control here. He was part of it. The hum grew louder, and then silence. Everything stopped. The ground ceased trembling. The falling debris froze midair. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, the cavern was still. Keanu's head turned sharply, his eyes locking onto Michelle's once more. His lips parted, and for the first time since they had entered the cavern, his voice broke through the eerie stillness. "You shouldn't have come." His voice was not his own. It was distorted, deep, and resonant, like the voice of something ancient and far more powerful than anything Michelle could comprehend. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. "Keanu, please, fight it. You have to." But Keanu's expression remained unchanged, his eyes cold and distant. "It's too late." Suddenly, The ground beneath them cracked open once more, this time with a deafening roar. The walls of the cavern began to collapse, and the entire chamber trembled violently. Michelle was thrown to the ground, her body slamming into the cold stone floor. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was Keanu, standing motionless in the center of the chaos, his body still connected to the ancient force that had been awakened. And then, all went black. When Michelle's eyes fluttered open again, the world around her was different. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, oppressive, and pressing in on her like an unyielding weight. Her body ached, every muscle sore from the fall, but it wasn't the physical pain that startled her. It was the presence, the palpable, suffocating force that seemed to seep into every crack and crevice of the cavern. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation a struggle against the pressure of the air around her. She blinked, trying to clear the haze in her mind, but it was as if her thoughts were muddled, distorted by the power that filled the chamber. The last thing she remembered was the ground splitting beneath them, the eerie silence, and Keanu's voice. His cold, distorted voice. Michelle. Jacob's voice sliced through the heavy air, sharp and panicked. She turned her head toward him, her eyes struggling to focus. He was crouched nearby, his hand outstretched toward her. His face was pale, his expression twisted in fear and confusion. "Are you okay? What happened? Where's Keanu?" Michelle's heart clenched at the mention of his name. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the pain in her arms and legs. The cavern was silent now, too silent, as if time itself had slowed down to a crawl. The air was still heavy with the presence of whatever ancient force was at the heart of this place, and it made her skin prickle with dread. "Keanu," she whispered, struggling to find her voice. He's not the same. He's changed." Her words felt foreign, distant, as if she were speaking through a fog. Jacob's eyes darted around the cavern, his gun now gripped tightly in his hands. "Where is he? What's going on?" "I don't know," Michelle murmured, shaking her head. He was standing there, but he wasn't himself. It was like he was part of it. The machine. Whatever this place is, it's using him. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The machine. The structure in the center of the room. The force that pulsed through the walls. The one that had controlled Keanu. This was no ordinary tomb, no simple artifact. It was a living, breathing entity, and Keanu had become its unwilling vessel. The thought made Michelle's stomach churn. Before she could voice her next thought, a low growl echoed through the cavern, sending a chill down her spine. The sound was inhuman, guttural, like a beast waking from a long slumber. Jacob's eyes widened. What the hell was that? The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. It reverberated through the ground beneath them, vibrating the very walls of the cavern. The shadows seemed to shift, as if they were alive, writhing in response to the sound. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. It's him. Keanu. He's changing. The words barely left her mouth before the shadows in the cavern began to converge, forming shapes, twisted, grotesque figures that slithered and writhed in the dim light. The symbols on the walls began to glow once more, and the humming noise returned, deeper now, like a low, resonating growl from the heart of the earth itself. From the center of the chamber, Keanu's silhouette emerged, but he was not the man they had known. His body was contorted, his limbs unnaturally elongated, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His skin had taken on a dark, ashen hue, and his face was a mask of incomprehensible horror. The force that controlled him was no longer subtle. It had taken hold completely, and now it was manifesting in a way that was both terrifying and unnatural. "Keanu!" Michelle shouted, her voice desperate. "Please fight it. You have to fight it." But Keanu didn't respond. His eyes, glowing with that eerie, unnatural light, locked onto her. But there was no recognition, no trace of the man she once knew. Only cold, unfeeling darkness. The growl came again, louder, more insistent, as Keanu took another step forward. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very cavern were alive, feeding off the force that now controlled him. Jacob grabbed Michelle's arm, his voice urgent. "We need to move. This place is coming apart. We have to get out of here now." But Michelle couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on Keanu, the man who had been her friend, the man who had been lost to something far older, far darker than she had ever imagined. And now, that darkness was spreading, consuming everything in its path. Jacob tugged at her arm, pulling her toward the exit, but Michelle yanked her arm free. "No, we can't leave him. We can't just leave Keanu like this. He's not Keanu anymore," Jacob shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "Don't you see? He's lost. He's gone." Michelle's mind raced, her heart torn between the desperate need to save Keanu and the instinct to escape the terrible force that had consumed him. She knew Jacob was right. Whatever Keanu had been, it was no longer him. It was something else, something monstrous. But still, she couldn't let go. She couldn't abandon him. And yet, in the pit of her stomach, she knew that the power in this place was too great for either of them to control. It wasn't just Keanu they were up against. It was whatever had bound him, whatever ancient force was pulling the strings from the shadows. "We have to stop it," Michelle said, her voice a whisper. "We have to stop it before it takes everything." But even as the words left her mouth, she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble again, harder this time. The shadows in the cavern seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own, and the growling noise grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost deafening. Keanu took another step forward. His eyes were locked on Michelle now, and for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a flash of the man he had been. And then, without warning, the ground cracked open once more, and the shadows surged forward, enveloping them. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the cavern with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. Michelle's breath hitched in her throat as the cavern seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The growling noise intensified, vibrating through the very ground beneath their feet, as though the earth itself was alive, trembling with the power of whatever force had taken hold of Keanu. Michelle stumbled backward, her mind racing. She could feel the presence of Keanu, the man she had once known, the man who had been consumed by something far older and more powerful than she could have ever imagined. But now, he was just a vessel, a puppet, and whatever had taken control of him, whatever dark force had inhabited his body, was growing stronger by the second. Jacob grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the far wall of the cavern, away from the chaos. "We can't stay here, Michelle," he shouted, his voice frantic. "This place is coming down, and it's not just Keanu we have to worry about anymore. That thing, whatever it is, it's awake. It's ready to consume us all." Michelle's eyes darted around the cavern, her heart racing. She could feel it now, that presence. The air was thick with power, ancient and raw, radiating from the center of the cavern where the structure pulsed with unnatural energy. And at the heart of it all stood Keanu, or what had been Keanu. His body was twisted and contorted, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light that sent a chill down Michelle's spine. She knew they had to do something. The power that controlled Keanu was too great, too vast for them to simply escape. It would follow them. It would destroy everything. But what could they do? They were standing at the edge of a precipice, with no way back, no way to stop the force that was about to consume them. "Michelle, listen to me," Jacob shouted, his grip tightening on her arm. "We need to find a way to shut this down, or we're all going to die. This place, Keanu, the force, whatever it is, it's going to rip us apart if we don't stop it." Michelle's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The key, the strange symbols, the hidden tunnel, Keanu's transformation. It was all connected. She knew it. But how? A sudden thought flashed through her mind. The structure. The pulsing machine-like monument at the center of the cavern. What if it wasn't just a source of power? What if it was the key to ending this madness? What if shutting it down could free Keanu and stop the force from consuming them all? Her heart pounded as she turned toward Jacob. "The structure," she shouted, pointing toward the glowing monument. "It's the source. If we can shut it down, maybe we can break the control it has over Keanu. We have to destroy it. Jacob's eyes widened with realization. You're right. But how the hell do we do that? Michelle didn't have an answer. She didn't know how, but she felt it deep in her bones. She felt that the solution was within reach, just beyond their grasp. The power that controlled Keanu had to have a way to be stopped, and that structure was the key. There was no time to waste. The walls of the cavern were starting to tremble again, the ground cracking beneath them, as though the very foundations of the world were buckling under the weight of the ancient force. The growling noise was deafening now, reverberating through every inch of the cavern, shaking the air, shaking the stone. Keanu took another step toward them. His body moved with unnatural speed. His eyes locked onto Michelle, filled with an emotionless intensity that made her stomach churn. The presence of the force was overwhelming, suffocating, and Michelle could feel it closing in, suffusing every inch of her being with dread. But still, she couldn't give up. She had to fight. For Keanu. For herself. For everything. Jacob, she shouted, pushing forward. Help me. We can't let it win. They made their way toward the center of the cavern, moving quickly but cautiously, every step taken in fear and uncertainty. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching for them as they neared the glowing structure. It loomed before them, dark and ominous, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to make their move. Michelle's hand instinctively went to the key. The warmth from the small metal object seemed to radiate through her, a lifeline in the midst of the chaos. She could feel its power, its connection to the structure, and she knew that somehow it was the key to breaking the force's hold over Keanu. Without thinking, she stepped forward, placing the key into a slot at the base of the monument. The moment her fingers made contact, the ground trembled once again, the cavern shaking with a violent force that threatened to throw them off their feet. The pulsing light from the structure intensified, blinding in its brilliance, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. The shadows in the cavern screamed, shrieking as though in agony, as though something was tearing at the very fabric of reality itself. Michelle felt a surge of power rush through her, a wave of energy that almost knocked her off balance. She gritted her teeth, her hand still clutching the key. The structure was alive, responding to her presence, to her touch. And then, without warning, a voice, deep, resonant, and ancient, echoed through the cavern. You cannot stop it. The voice was Keanu's voice, but twisted, warped by the power that had overtaken him. His body lurched forward, his form stretching and contorting unnaturally, as though he were being torn apart from the inside out. Michelle's heart lurched. This was it, the moment of truth. They had to stop this now, before Keanu was lost forever. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the cavern seemed to collapse around them. Michelle could feel the power surging through her, through the key, through the very air itself. The structure was shaking, its energy building to a fever pitch. But Michelle wouldn't back down. With a cry, she twisted the key. The moment Michelle twisted the key, the world seemed to shatter. The air around her crackled with violent energy, the force of it making her feel as though she were standing in the heart of a storm. The glowing structure pulsed with an unnatural light, its power surging like a tidal wave ready to crash down on them. Every fiber of Michelle's being screamed in protest, urging her to let go, to run, but she refused. She had to see this through. For Keanu. For everyone. The growl, the deep, guttural sound that had haunted them from the moment they stepped into the cavern, grew louder, fiercer. It felt as if the walls themselves were alive, echoing with the voice of something far older than humanity. It was the voice of the force that had controlled Keanu, the force that was now consuming the entire cavern. Michelle, Jacob shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of noise. You have to stop. It's too much. It's gonna break everything. Michelle didn't respond. She couldn't. Her focus was entirely on the key, still embedded in the slot of the monument. A deep, hollow hum vibrated through the floor, through her chest, as the structure seemed to breathe, its pulsating light intensifying with every passing second. The cavern shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the crumbling ceiling. She could see Keanu's form now, moving toward them, his body unnaturally contorted, his limbs twisted in grotesque angles. The light in his eyes flickered with malice, a deep, unnatural red that sent a shock of terror through Michelle's veins. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else entirely. But even in the madness, Michelle couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The energy from the structure was no longer just chaotic power. It felt directed, focused. She could almost feel it aligning with her. The key, it was her connection to the Force, to this place, to Keanu. It wasn't just unlocking something. It was giving her the power to stop it. She could stop it. The thought barely registered before the ground shook again, this time harder, sending a shockwave of force that knocked Michelle off her feet. She screamed, her arms flailing as she tried to keep her balance, but her body was tossed backward like a rag doll. "Michelle," Jacob cried, reaching out and grabbing her arm, pulling her to her feet just as the cavern seemed to groan under the weight of the destructive energy surging through it. Keanu's distorted figure was now closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes locked onto Michelle, but they were devoid of recognition, filled only with that ancient, malevolent force. He took another step forward, his mouth opening in a silent snarl, but there was no trace of the Keanu she had known. She swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. He was beyond saving, wasn't he? The thought made her sick to her stomach. The Keanu she had known, the friend who had stood by her through everything, was lost. But that didn't mean she could give up. She turned to Jacob, her voice trembling. "We have to keep going. We can't let it win." Jacob's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "But Michelle, we're not going to survive this. Look at him. Look at what's happening." His voice cracked as he pointed toward the structure, where the power was reaching its peak, the pulsing light blinding in its intensity. Michelle couldn't back down now. She had to trust that the key was more than just a trigger. It was their only chance. "Jacob, help me!" she shouted, her hand reaching for the key again, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. "We have to destroy it." Before Jacob could respond, the world around them began to tear apart. A deafening roar filled the cavern as the structure emitted a blinding flash of light, consuming everything in its wake. The ground beneath their feet buckled and cracked, the walls of the cavern caving in as though they were paper. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, and the shadows that had once been distant now writhed and swarmed around them, closing in with a terrifying speed. Michelle's heart raced. There was no more time. She was running on pure instinct now, gripping the key with all her strength as she twisted it further, pushing deeper into the monument's heart. The energy responding to her touch was overwhelming. She could feel it course through her, twisting her body with its raw, primal power. The cavern trembled as though in agony, and Michelle realized with a sickening clarity that whatever force had possessed Keanu, whatever entity had awakened in this place, was now fighting for its very existence. But Michelle wasn't going to let it win. "Michelle." Jacob's voice was frantic, barely audible over the chaos. "It's too much. We can't." The key in Michelle's hand pulsed once more, a shockwave of power surging through her body. For a brief, agonizing moment, the world around her seemed to freeze. Everything went silent, the growling, the rumbling, the screeching shadows. All of it faded into an eerie, all-encompassing quiet. And then, with a violent jolt, the force of the energy was released. The explosion of light was blinding, like the birth of a star, and the cavern seemed to implode, collapsing in on itself with a terrifying speed. Michelle was thrown backward, her body crashing into the jagged stone walls as the very ground beneath her seemed to crumble away. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. When Michelle regained consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It was an absolute, suffocating stillness that pressed in on her from all sides, heavy and oppressive. She opened her eyes slowly, her head throbbing with a dull ache. The cavern, once filled with the pulsating energy of the machine and the shadows of the ancient force, was now eerily empty. The light from the monument had faded, its power extinguished. The walls, though cracked, still stood, but the overwhelming sense of danger had lifted. The air was still thick with dust, but the oppressive weight of the force had vanished. And Keanu, her breath caught in her throat as she saw him. He was lying on the ground, his body crumpled in an unnatural heap. His once glowing eyes were now closed, the color of his skin returning to its normal hue. He looked like the Keanu she remembered, fragile and human once more. But was it too late? Jacob was the first to approach, cautiously, his gun still drawn. He stared down at Keanu's motionless body, his expression conflicted. "Is he?" Jacob started, but his voice trailed off. Michelle knelt beside Keanu, her heart pounding as she reached out to touch his hand. His skin was cool, but there was still life in him. She felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had been saved. But as her fingers brushed against his, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Not just in him, but in all of them. Something had been unleashed. Something far beyond their understanding. "We need to get out of here," Michelle whispered, her voice hoarse. "We're not safe yet." The ground trembled once more. The tremors continued to shake the cavern as Michelle and Jacob crouched near Keanu's lifeless form. The air still hummed with the remnants of the energy that had once surged through the monument, but now it was just a faint echo, barely noticeable amid the ongoing collapse of the cavern. The structure, once so powerful and ominous, was now reduced to little more than a cracked ruin, its glowing pulse extinguished. Yet, something still felt wrong. Michelle's heart raced as she hovered over Keanu's body, her fingers gently brushing his cold skin. She couldn't be sure, but it almost felt like he was sleeping. It was the same stillness that had followed the cessation of the destructive energy, like the calm after a storm. She leaned down, checking for a pulse. Nothing. A wave of dread washed over her, and for a moment, Michelle felt the crushing weight of failure. Had she made the wrong choice? Had she killed him in her effort to save him? But before she could retreat into the suffocating darkness of her thoughts, a quiet gasp escaped from Keanu's lips. His eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, his eyes opened. Michelle's breath caught in her throat as she gazed into those eyes. Eyes that were no longer glowing with malevolent energy, but filled with confusion, fear, and, most unsettling of all, recognition. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice trembling. He blinked a few times, as if trying to focus, then his gaze shifted toward her. A small frown appeared on his face, but it wasn't twisted with darkness anymore. There was no hatred in his expression, no violence. "Michelle," Keanu murmured, his voice hoarse. He took a deep breath, wincing slightly. "What happened?" Jacob stepped closer, his expression still guarded, but filled with a strange mix of relief and suspicion. "You're alive," he said, his voice gruff. "I didn't think you would be." Keanu slowly sat up, his hand reaching out to brace himself against the ground. His movements were slow, as though he were still regaining control over his body. His eyes scanned the wreckage of the cavern and then turned back to Michelle. I don't know," he said, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog. "The last thing I remember is the tunnel. I don't even remember how I got here." The truth hit Michelle like a tidal wave, and the fear she had been holding in her chest evaporated for just a moment. "You were possessed, Keanu. Something took control of you." He nodded slowly, as though the pieces were coming together. "I remember a voice. It was so loud, so commanding. It wasn't mine. It told me to do things, terrible things. But then," his voice trailed off as he seemed to lose himself in the memories. "You were used, Keanu," Michelle said softly, her heart aching for him. "But you're free now. We stopped it." Keanu's eyes widened as he processed the weight of her words. "Free? I'm free?" Jacob, still cautious, looked over his shoulder at Michelle. "I'm not so sure. That thing, whatever it was, could still be out there. It could have used you, Keanu, to get what it wanted. We don't know what it's capable of." Michelle's mind raced. She understood Jacob's concern. The force that had taken control of Keanu wasn't just a malicious entity. It was ancient, powerful, and malevolent in ways they couldn't begin to understand. but she couldn't let that doubt cloud what they had just achieved. For now, Keanu was back. That was something. Something worth holding on to. I can't stay here, Keanu said suddenly, his voice shaking. I can't stay where it all happened. It's too much. I need to leave. Michelle nodded. We all do. But we need to be careful. We don't know what we've unleashed in this place, and it's not over yet. The tunnel, there's still something we haven't uncovered. Something connected to all of this. Keanu looked up at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. What tunnel? The one under your villa, Jacob said, his voice low. We haven't been able to get any answers yet. And if that force was capable of all of this, it's possible that it's been waiting for years. We have to find out what it really was before it finds us. Keanu's expression darkened. He stood up with effort, still shaking off the effects of whatever force had gripped him. His eyes flickered to the exit of the cavern, where the light from the surface seemed so distant, so far away. Then let's find out. Whatever it is, it's not done with us. Outside the cavern, the air was crisp and cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat inside the cavern's walls. The trio emerged from the wreckage of the tunnel, their senses heightened by the unsettling quiet that surrounded them. They made their way through the dense forest, each step carrying them farther away from the nightmare they had just survived. But even as they walked, there was no sense of relief. Something still hung in the air, something that hadn't been fully dealt with. As they reached the edge of the woods, Michelle's mind was swirling. The key, the tunnel, Keanu's villa. They hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of what had happened, and yet it felt as though time was slipping away from them. Keanu, she said quietly, her eyes searching his, you said you didn't remember much, but there's something you should know. That villa, it's been connected to all of this. The history behind it, the research your family was doing, it's all tied together. We might be able to find answers in the walls of your home, maybe even more than we can imagine. Keanu turned to face her, his eyes dark and thoughtful. My family? He paused, the weight of the statement sinking in. I don't know what you mean. Michelle bit her lip, trying to gather her thoughts. Your family built that villa over something. A hidden history, a legacy they buried for a reason. I don't think this is just about you, Keanu. It's about something far bigger. Something that might have been waiting beneath your feet for generations. The tension in the air thickened as Keanu stared back at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a dark cloud. He nodded slowly, his expression hardening with determination. If it's in my family's history, then it's time we find out what we've been running from. Let's go. I'm not running anymore. The drive back to Keanu's villa felt like an eternity. Every mile that passed under the tires seemed to stretch longer, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Keanu, who had once been the picture of calm and poise, now sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings like a man who knew something dark was lurking just beyond sight. Michelle could feel the tension radiating from him, and even Jacob, usually so grounded, was unusually quiet in the back seat. They were heading toward something neither of them fully understood, but they all felt the weight of it pressing down on them. The villa, with its elegant facade and old-world charm, now felt like something far more sinister, a symbol of everything they had just uncovered and everything they feared was still to come. Michelle glanced over at Keanu, who seemed lost in thought. His face was pale, the lingering effects of whatever had possessed him still haunting his features. She knew he had come back to himself, but that didn't mean he was truly free. There was something still there, an invisible thread that connected him to the darkness beneath, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken root in the villa was waiting for them. Keanu, she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. Are you okay? He blinked and looked over at her, as though snapping out of a trance. Yeah, he replied, his voice distant. Just thinking. I don't remember much, but what I do remember, he trailed off, his brow furrowing. It's like I was someone else. Like my body was just a shell for something else. Michelle nodded, understanding. That's what it felt like. You weren't in control. Whatever that force was, it had a hold on you. But we got you out of it. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly, the uncertainty in them shifting towards something darker. But did we really? What if it's still inside me? What if it's waiting to come back? Michelle opened her mouth to reassure him, but Jacob cut in before she could speak. It doesn't matter. We're not out of danger yet. Whatever happened here, whatever is in that villa, we need to face it. You can't keep running from this, Keanu. We need answers. Keanu turned toward the villa, his gaze hardening. The once welcoming sight of the mansion now seemed like a fortress of secrets, its dark windows reflecting only the threat that waited for them inside. The villa loomed over them as they approached, the familiar driveway now feeling like a path to a grave. Keanu's footsteps were hesitant as he led them toward the front door, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped the brass handle. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though the house was daring them to enter, daring them to confront the dark history it had buried. The air around them felt heavy, as if the villa itself was holding its breath. And then, as though it had been waiting for them, the door creaked open on its own. The coldness that greeted them inside was suffocating. Michelle could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she stepped over the threshold. The grand foyer, once warm and inviting, now felt like a tomb. Shadows clung to every corner, and the air had a stale, ancient scent, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for them to return. Keanu led the way, his expression unreadable as he passed through the hallways, his hand brushing against the old walls. The house was vast, and every room they passed seemed to hold memories that had been locked away for far too long. The walls, decorated with portraits of his ancestors, all seemed to stare down at them, their eyes hauntingly fixed in place. "We need to get to the basement," Keanu muttered, his voice tight. That's where it all started. The basement. Michelle's stomach churned at the thought of descending further into the heart of the darkness that had taken hold of Keanu. But there was no turning back now. She had to see this through, had to understand what had happened, what was happening. They reached the staircase that led down to the basement, and Keanu hesitated for a moment, staring down into the abyss below. The steps were old, creaking with every movement as if protesting their descent. "I've never been down there," Keanu said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I was told to stay away. There's something down there. My family, they kept it locked away for a reason." Michelle exchanged a glance with Jacob, then took a step forward. "It's time to find out why." They descended into the darkness, the only sound the echo of their footsteps. The basement was cold, the temperature dropping with each step they took. When they reached the bottom, they were greeted by the sight of a large steel door, old and rusted, but still sturdy, as though it had been built to keep something in. Keanu's hand shook as he reached for the handle, but he didn't hesitate. With a heavy pull, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with old furniture covered in dust, shelves lined with books that hadn't been touched in decades, and strange artifacts scattered about. Strange symbols carved into the stone walls, their meaning unclear but undeniably ancient. And in the center of the room, sitting atop a pedestal, was a small, intricately carved box. The box was unassuming at first glance, but the moment Michelle laid eyes on it, she felt a chill run through her. The energy in the room seemed to shift, a subtle change that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. "This is it," Keanu said, his voice thick with both fear and reverence. "This is what my family was hiding. The key to everything." Michelle moved toward the pedestal, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and lifted the box with trembling hands, feeling the weight of its significance. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a rush of images flooded her mind. Images of ancient rituals, of voices chanting in a language she didn't recognize, of dark figures standing in shadows, watching, waiting. It was like a part of her memory had been unlocked, a part of her soul that had been buried deep within. The same darkness that had consumed Keanu, that had been lurking beneath the villa, was now awake in her. "Michelle?" Jacob's voice cut through her trance, his hand on her shoulder. "What's happening?" She blinked, disoriented, and slowly turned to face him. Her mind was racing, pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but the full picture was still out of reach. I don't know," she said, her voice shaky. "But we need to open it. We need to know what's inside." Keanu stepped forward, his face pale as he stared at the box in her hands. Whatever it is, we've already gone too far. We have to finish this. With a deep breath, Michelle opened the box. The moment Michelle opened the box, a cold wind swept through the basement. The air grew thick with an unnatural chill, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. The tiny, intricate box, once just an object of curiosity, had become something far more dangerous. A low hum vibrated through the stone walls, and the faint glow that had been dormant in the cavern under Keanu's villa flickered to life again, this time brighter, more insistent. Michelle felt it before she saw it, a dark presence gathering in the room, seeping from the cracks in the stone and the shadows of the forgotten artifacts. It was like something ancient, something hungry, was awakening from its slumber. The box, now open, revealed nothing at first glance. It was empty, save for a single, thin shard of dark, black crystal lying within. But that shard was enough. Keanu, who had been watching Michelle with wide, fearful eyes, stepped back, his face blanching as the energy in the room grew more intense. This is what my family hid," he whispered hoarsely, his voice laced with horror. "It's not just a relic. It's a piece of it. The thing that had control over me, over everything." Jacob stepped forward, his brow furrowing as he stared at the shard, which now seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. "We need to destroy it. Whatever it is, we can't let it stay here." But as soon as he spoke, the air around them seemed to snap. The basement flickered with light, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe, as though the very walls themselves were alive. The hum grew louder, more frantic, and Michelle could feel the dark force pushing against them, clawing to be freed. Then, as if on cue, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Michelle gripped the pedestal to steady herself. "It's not over. It wants to escape." The shard in the box seemed to glow brighter, and the temperature in the room plummeted further. The walls themselves appeared to be shuddering, as though the very foundations of the villa were being ripped apart. "What's happening?" Keanu breathed, his voice strained with panic. "It's whatever is inside. It's coming." Michelle could barely hear him over the sound of the rumbling and the piercing hum of the crystal. She felt a wave of terror flood over her, but beneath the fear, something else stirred, an understanding, a deep knowing. This wasn't just a force trying to break free, it was a calling. The crystal shard wasn't just some relic, it was a conduit, and it was reaching out, drawing them in. "We need to leave," Jacob shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to get out of here now." But it was already too late. The floor beneath them cracked, and the entire basement seemed to collapse in on itself. Michelle felt herself being pulled down, her grip on the pedestal slipping as the room buckled around her. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shard, glowing brighter than ever, and then nothing. When Michelle opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the villa. The cold, suffocating air was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. She sat up, her head spinning. She was no longer in the basement. She was outside, under a sky that stretched dark and endless above her. Her breath hitched as she scanned the surrounding area. The landscape was unfamiliar, twisted trees with dark branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, and the air was thick with an ancient, unsettling energy. It was as though they had crossed into another world entirely. A quick glance around told her that Jacob and Keanu were with her, but they were just as disoriented. Jacob was already standing, looking around with wide, fearful eyes. Keanu, too, seemed stunned, but there was something different in his expression, something more resigned. "What is this place?" Jacob's voice trembled. "Where are we?" "I don't know," Michelle said, her own voice shaky. She pushed herself to her feet, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The shard had pulled them somewhere. But where? "This," Keanu began, his voice far more distant than it had been before. "This is not a place meant for living. It's a prison. A place where things are kept." Michelle's stomach churned. The ground beneath them seemed alive, writhing with darkness, and the sky above was swirling with an eerie, unnatural glow. The air felt wrong, as if every breath she took was suffused with an ancient, oppressive weight. "There's no way out, is there?" Jacob muttered, his voice filled with dread. He turned toward Keanu, his expression incredulous. "You knew about this place?" Keanu's face hardened, but there was fear behind his eyes. Fear that Michelle had seen only once before, back when he was under the entity's control. "I didn't know it would be like this," he replied, his voice low. "But yes, my family, they used to come here. They built the villa to contain this place." Michelle felt a rush of clarity. The villa had been built as a barrier, a prison, to keep something far worse from escaping. The crystal shard had been the key, and now they were trapped, here, with whatever they had unwittingly unleashed. She turned back to Keanu, her eyes filled with both dread and determination. "We need to destroy the shard. Destroy everything." Keanu nodded grimly, his eyes flickering with something fierce and resolute. "It won't be that easy, but we'll have to try." As they moved through the desolate, twisted landscape, the air grew heavier. The shadows around them deepened, pulling at their senses. Michelle could feel the weight of the force growing stronger with every step, and she could tell that Keanu felt it too. The connection to the darkness had not been severed. It was stronger than ever. But Michelle was determined. Whatever this place was, they had to find a way to destroy the shard and escape. If they didn't, they would be trapped forever, and whatever power had brought them here would be free to spread its chaos and terror into the world beyond. They had no choice. They had to stop it, and this time, they had to destroy the force for good.